Welcome to this session on national education policy and the historical evolution of education policy in India. I lead research at Center for Civil Society, and over the last couple of years have been involved with the Center's position on various facets of education reform in India, particularly in the school education sector. I want to walk you broadly through sort of the evolution of how our union government has approached education since independence. So since 1947, where the compulsions on the newly formed republic were very different, and how that has evolved over many, many years. One of the biggest, so the first step in setting up an education policy for this country came in the year 1964, when we began with setting up the Kothari Commission. The Kothari Commission was headed by Daulat Singh Kothari, who was then the chairman of the University Grants Commission, what we today know as UGC. The idea of the commission was to basically, more than anything else, advise the government for a standardized pattern of education for the whole of the country. And the idea then was that there were several different systems that were being followed in different parts of the country, and there was a need to develop some kind of standardization around curriculum, around the format, around exit certification, around boards, around accreditation, so on and so forth. And so the Kothari Commission had a very big task before it, which was to sort of lay the foundations of how the Republic would, from that point on, deal with matters of education policy. The Kothari Commission report then led to, and I will walk you through the key issues discussed and the key recommendations made at every single stage. But let me just sort of walk you through very quickly through the chronology. The Kothari Commission submitted its report in about 1966. And just after that, in 1968, we had our first national policy on education. About 20 years later, in 1985, the government realized that we must review the existing national policy on education, and then come up with a new policy on education. This happened in 1986. In 1991 and 1992, we again had two expert committees. The first was the Ramamurthy Committee, and then the Reddy Committee, which recommended a national program of action on how to execute the 1986 policy. Cut forward another sort of 18-20 years, and in the interim, we have the Right to Education Act in 2009. Of course, today we realize that the Right to Education Act is sort of the big founding law in the country on how education, school education in particular, is imparted in different states. Most of you are probably familiar that a few weeks ago, the government finally notified the new National Education Policy, National Education Policy 2020. This policy was in the making since the NDA government took office in 2014. In fact, the discussions around it began a little before it as well. There were two expert committees that were set up. The first, of course, the Subramanian Committee, which submitted its report in 2016, and followed by the Kothari Education Committee, which submitted its report in 2019. Based on deliberations on both the Subramanian Committee as well as the Kothari Education Committee, the Ministry of Human Resources and Development, now has been renamed Ministry of Education, submitted a pithy version of both committee reports as the National Education Policy 2020. So that's sort of the 50-60-year journey of where we are, where we've come as far as having a national policy on education. Before I go forward on discussing the sort of key recommendations among these different policy reports, I want to familiarize you with some terms. First is, of course, law, right? And the idea of law is that it is enforceable. In that Right to Education Act is the law of the land. This is different than a policy. So a policy is sort of somewhere in between a law and a committee report, right? So a committee report can be of different stylings. You could have parliamentary committees, you could have expert committees that are commissioned by the government or by parliament. You could have ad hoc committees and so on and so forth. A policy, sort of more than anything else, indicates the intent of the government of the day. The idea is that it has been informed by expert views, by public consultations, by wide-ranging considerations, and hopefully also by cost and benefit analysis. And then it puts out a statement of intent. Often the statement of intent is then subsequently backed either by law or by modification of regulations or by setting up some kind of an implementation framework to execute it. This is where a policy sort of becomes interesting, right? In that, if we look at the National Education Policy 2020, it is not enforceable. The only thing we know is that this is how the government of the day is thinking about key issues in education. These are all the things that have been at the top of their mind. These are sort of the broad thrusts that the education sector will take. These are the broad areas of reform that the government is considering, and potentially some of these will require legislative change. So, for example, some amendments in RDE may follow, some amendments in state level law may follow, so on and so forth. Okay. So, with that sort of quick brief on the terminologies associated with the National Education Policy, let me walk you through sort of some of the seminal moments in India's journey of having education policy. The first, of course, like I told you, is to begin, it was the Kothari Commission report, and that this was set up in 1964, and in some ways, no conversation on education takes place in India without referring back to the Kothari Commission report. And the Kothari Commission report at the time was, sort of a 20-person committee, but it had done an extensive job of consultations. It had gone through, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 2,500 individual government memorandums, consulted over 900 experts, over the course of 2 years had done its deliberations and then come up with a 287-page report on education and what the direction of education in India ought to be. Some big sort of big issues that the Commission report dealt with. At the time, like I mentioned, the mandate given to the Kothari Commission was to determine a standardized pattern of education for India, right? To reduce the variations, to figure out what our whole approach was going to be, what curriculum might potentially look like, where the emphasis areas might be, and generally what your structure of education would be. The committee report largely focused sort of, and this reflects also the time, the time of the day or the mood of the day, reflected on 4 big themes. The first, of course, was how do you increase productivity using education? The second was how do you promote national and social integration? Remember, this is the early days of the Republic, and we were coming out of partition and coming out of a lot of internal turmoil. And so using the, how do you use education and education curriculum to build this sense of integration and to build a national identity. The third big theme was modernization. How do you bring technology and technology-related education within the syllabus, within the curriculum, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the fourth big theme of the report, as well as the committee's deliberations, was the social model and spiritual values that the education system ought to be able to convey. The biggest recommendation of the Kothari Commission was sort of the large-scale internal transformation of the sector. And this culminated into the 1968 National Policy on Education, which is India's first national policy laying out a national vision. Right? The policy called for radical reconstruction to improve education. One, it recommended a national schooling system. Second, it recommended free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14. This was also part of the directive principles of state policy in our constitution. Third, it made recommendations about teacher status, salaries, and sort of their standing, their minimum requirements, so on and so forth. It also was the first to set up what we call the 3-language formula. So how does school, what is the medium of instruction, what kind of languages do children learn in school, and what will that pattern be when you get to opt languages and so on. The most important thing in my view was setting up the 10 plus 2 plus 3, the 10 plus 3 plus 2 system of education, right? Which is that there is school education, there is high school education, so 11th and 12th, and then college education of 3 years. This is the uniform pattern of education that is followed throughout the country, going from standard 1 all the way into the final year of graduation of college. It also recommended that the government put a lot of emphasis on strengthening research in higher education. Interestingly, a theme that has been reinforced in our most recent education policy. So this is the first big event, as it were, in setting out this national vision. So the Kothari Commission comes up, works for 2 years, does deliberations for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, submits a report. And in 1968, 2 years following the submission of the report, we have our first education policy. Then we fast forward another 20 years. And in 1986 is when, 1985 and 1986 is when we first undertake a review of how well have we stood by the 1968 policy, how well have we been able to execute the recommendations of the Kothari Commission, and subsequently what should the direction be from this point forward. And in this, of course, these deliberations, these reviews culminated in the 1986 policy. And the 1986 policy recommended sort of a new thrust in education. These are not widely different from each other, but I think sort of reinforcing very strongly that we need to be doubling down on education of our people, not just in terms of literacy, but also in terms of capability, competence, productivity, so on and so forth. And the new thrust in elementary education over all other parts of the education length was to ensure universal enrollment and retention until age 14. And second was also minorly to substantially improve the quality of education. But at the time, the emphasis was really in one, let's get children into school, let's equip them with the basics and ensure that they stay in school or at least complete large parts of the school, sort of the standardization of school. The 86 policy also sort of began to talk about a child-centric approach. Operation Blackboard, some of you may already be familiar with this, is just simply a move to be able to provide the infrastructure, basic infrastructure to primary schools nationwide, right? To make sure that they have the facilities via which they are able to teach, not necessarily fancy facilities, but basic facilities across the board in every single public primary school in India. The 86 policy also made a few additional new recommendations. The first was sort of reflecting on how do you increase the availability or the access to equal opportunities among disadvantaged groups, right? So, for example, thinking about rural India as different from urban India. So, what can we do in terms of scholarships, in terms of adult education programs, and in terms of open universities or open schools even, so that folks who are unable to attend a full-time school or have constraints in their life are still able to access some form of learning and are able to get some kind of an exit certificate that was proving to be really essential. So a 10th pass certificate, a 12th pass certificate, and so on and so forth, right? The 1986 policy also sort of strengthened and enlarged the non-formal education program. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time that the idea of an open school was set up. I think CBSE was the first to begin this discussion on, or began a pilot approach on open schooling in India. Subsequently, a few years later, MHRD subsumed that within its framework, and now you have the National Institute of Open Schooling that is available for what we call non-traditional learners. So either those who are homeschooled or those who have not been able to attend a full school full-time or have had other kinds of challenges in their life, such as disability. This national policy on education, largely in my conversation, I'm emphasizing on school education because this is the area that I'm most familiar with. But the national education policy is by no means focused on school education. It treats all parts of the education spectrum sort of fairly in depth. And in that spirit, the 86 policy, of course, talked about higher education as well. And the one big recommendation that it made as far as higher education went is to sort of have the idea of autonomous colleges gradually over time replacing the affiliating sort of university affiliations, right? So most of you will have gone to colleges that were attached to one of the other public universities. So, for example, I went to St. Xavier's College, which until a few years ago, was affiliated with Mumbai University. And this is true for most universities in India, the trend that is now changing finally, 20 years after the 86 policy first called for this kind of move. It also encouraged the creation of autonomous departments within universities, sort of standalone centers of excellence or centers of specialization, etc. Now, fast forward another sort of few years, and once the 1986 policy came up, so the next big question was, how are we going to execute the 1986 policy? What are we going to do in order to be able to give life to its intentions? And in the 1990s, they began the discussion on, the National Program of Action. And this happened via two committee reports. In 1991, the Ramamurthy Committee made recommendations, and in 1992, the Reddy Committee made recommendations. And both of these emphasized heavily on the execution strategy that was necessary to give life to the intentions. So, for example, in the case of the 86 policy, the Ramamurthy Committee and the Reddy Committee first conducted a review, right, of where are we in implementation, where are we in status, so how many children are in school, what are the big challenges that these children are typically facing, what are the challenges that the center and states are facing in order to be able to execute this, and based on that, how do we make a transition, right? At this time is also when education sort of became a concurrent subject. It was implementable only if union and states worked together to get this sort of national vision realized, right? One big sort of thrust of the National Action Plan was to think about how do you reform management of education in its entirety. So everything from state advisory boards of education to setting up district level boards of education, setting up village education committees, which have taken on a slightly different form more recently, and thinking about how do you put in institutional mechanisms that help with accountability, that help with monitoring, and that also help with awareness building and persuasion. And this was sort of the big thrust of the National Action Plan before subsequently we come to the next iteration of national policy on education. The review committees also, the program of action, also made another set of recommendations. The first recommendation was, how do you get your education system to cater towards women, disadvantaged groups, minorities, and those with disabilities, or as we call them, specially abled. How do we, either through vehicles of financing or of course through other kinds of access mechanisms such as specialized institutions, specialized teaching professionals, and specialized curriculum and so on. Finally, the last part of the big recommendation in the National Action Plan of 1992 was common entrance exams into professional and technical programs. Many of you have probably already battled the challenges of the national entrance programs, right? Whether it is the JEE, JEE, IIT entrance programs, whether it is the entrance programs for medical education, for teacher training, for legal professions, so on and so forth. And there is many such stages and many such specialized professions which require this kind of entrance examination. Cut forward 2 decades again. And this is interesting because roughly we see that every 2 decades there is an attempt to reflect and an attempt to change. So from 1992, the program, National Program of Action, we come to 2009, where the Right to Education Act was passed by the Parliament of India. The Right to Education Act emphasized on free and compulsory education for all children of India between 6 and 14 years of age. It insisted on a few different parameters. First, that no school could operate in India unless it was recognized by the government, and it put in place a recognition framework. this particular recommendation, no, this particular move of the Right to Education Act has come under heavy criticism. And in fact, the current National Education Policy 2020 has asked for a review of the input-centric approach of the Right to Education Act. So, for example, Right to Education Act demands that all private schools in the country must meet infrastructure requirements such as access to a playground or a certain number of toilets, a certain floor length, set pupil-teacher ratio, fixed salaries to teachers in these schools, and so on and so forth. It also introduced a very novel way of being able to provide inclusion into or broaden the opportunities available to children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and what it calls ESWS category, meaning economically and socially weaker sections of society. And under Section 12(1)(c) of the Right to Education Act, we had quite a radical measure. And the idea was that 25% of seats in all private schools of the country would be reserved for children from economically and socially weaker sections of society. And the government would reimburse the private schools either based on their fee structure or on the state's per child expenditure in public schools, whichever was lower. Unfortunately, despite the good intentions of the policy, this has been only partially successful. Schools have struggled to get reimbursed from the government. There has been a lot of challenges in changing mindsets around integration. There have also been a lot of challenges around sort of corruption and fair play in the sector. So this is something, again, that the Kothari Education Committee report subsequently asked for a review of, and suggested that if you want to be enhancing access to private education, there are other ways of possibly getting to the same goals. Lastly, the Right to Education Act also introduced something else radical. It introduced the no detention policy, and the idea was to reduce the kind of pressure that children had to face in the education system. That the key stage examination story would be replaced by continuous comprehensive evaluation, but the continuous comprehensive evaluation was intended to improve the learning and comprehension of children, not to hold them back. This, of course, again, a policy with good intention, met with an enormous amount of resistance from every quarter. More than anything else, because really examinations within the school were the only metric that parents had to be able to test how their children were faring, and in some ways to also hold a school accountable for ensuring that their children were learning more at a consistent pace. So this is sort of the big brush of the national education policy, and in some ways that's a whole lecture all by itself, and I'm sure in the MOOC there will probably be a detailed module on the Right to Education Act. Cut forward another 10 years, and in 2014, of course, right from the early days of the Right to Education Act, we already saw an enormous amount of rumbling. The Act was amended a couple of times. It was criticized because it made no mention of learning outcomes. It focused a lot on inputs without thinking about our children learning. And in the interim, Pratham had been conducting the annual status of education, publishing its annual status of education report every single year, and simply showing us sort of what the status of learning was across the country, across income groups, across school types, so on and so forth. And what ASAR began to show us is that no matter how much we were spending on education, our children were unfortunately not learning. And this has created an enormous crisis of sort of conscience in the system. And when the the NDA government came in, their first order of business was to commission new education policy. In some ways, remember, the last education policy that the country had was in 1986. And since then, we've not had refresh of at least a statement of intent. Yes, we have the Right to Education Act, but not a statement of intent, which is more broad-based, which is far more sort of long view in terms of what ought to change, or what our success metrics ought to be. Since 2014, the government began talking about recommissioning a national education policy. First, it set up the Subramanian Committee report. Again, these are ad hoc expert committees that are led by senior experts from outside government that then present their recommendations based on expert consultations, consultations with state governments, consultations with parents, consultations with all kinds of stakeholders, and extensive review of evidence and literature, and of course, internal working documents of the government. The Subramanian Committee submitted its report in 2016. And the first big recommendation that it made is that we need to review the Right to Education Act, that there is something that is not working as intentioned, and there are parts of the Act that are producing unintended consequences, and that perhaps we need to think about these kinds of questions in a different way. The second big recommendation from the Subramanian Committee report was you also need to think about dispute resolution mechanism, particularly how do you enforce accountability if you do not have a way to pull up state education department officials for their responsibility. So it recommended setting up state-level tribunals on education. It also recommended the consolidation of small schools. So I'm not sure if you have followed the data on schooling in India, but in particular in the case of public sector schools, most schools in India are very small and marginal in size. So part of the challenge of running very small schools, if you recall, the Right to Education Act, in fact, had explicitly stated that the government would build local schools or provide access to neighborhood schools within 1 or 2 kilometers, within every 1 or 2 kilometers. And that emphasis on building schools meant that most schools were sort of not operating at economies of scale. It meant that you had to make do with one teacher teaching multiple classes and multiple subjects, or sort of make do with the same infrastructure for small amount of kids, rather than be able to take advantage of sharing resources across a larger number of children. And so the idea of consolidating many of these uneconomical small public schools into larger schools and providing their infrastructure and transportation support to children to be able to get to these schools. This was another big recommendation of the Subramanian Committee report. Of course, they also recommended expanding the open schooling facilities. If you recall, I had mentioned that the National Institute for Open Schooling already existed. They also recommended that we can expand this into state open schooling or strengthen state open schooling infrastructure, and to think about improving the curriculum, the technology, as well as the validity of the certificates that open schools were providing to students. It doubled down on the 3-language formula. And lastly, it recommended that in the case of higher education, the role of the University Grants Commission be reviewed. That it no longer be both an accreditor as well as a fund disperser, but it simplify its role into only financing of universities rather than accreditation and affiliation. It recommended that there be an entirely separate body called the National Accreditation Body that would go about accrediting universities and colleges and so on, institutions of higher learning. The Subramanian Committee report, I think, met with some amount of not so much opposition, but challenge from several stakeholders. And very quickly, the government approached Dr. Kothari Rangan to convene yet another committee to, one, reflect on the Subramanian Committee report, but also come up with its own set of recommendations that would eventually be sort of distilled into the national education policy. Kothari Rangan, Dr. Kothari Rangan and his committee submitted the report in 2019. And between 2016 and 2019, there were a series of deliberations. CCS, for example, has made multiple representations to both the Subramanian Committee as well as the Kothari Rangan Committee. Just as the commissions and the committees before, they have spoken to a wide range of stakeholders, traveled across the country, and tried to be as comprehensive in their recommendations as possible. The Kothari Rangan Committee report was almost 480 pages long. And in fact, at the time, it was called the Draft National Education Policy. And it was thorough in that it covered every single aspect of education curriculum, management, administration, financing, and of course regulation. And this was a big, in all the years of Education Commission reports, this was, I think, the first time that regulation, the question of what are the rules of the game for public schools and private schools, public universities and private universities, was taken very, very seriously. And the architecture around the regulation was given a lot of consideration, which is different than the approach of the previous years, where the emphasis was what can the government do in terms of intervention and setting up more schools, in financing additionally, and so on and so forth. Again, like the Subramanian Committee, Kasturi Rangan Committee recommended a review of Right to Education Act. In particular, asked for a review of 12(1)(c). If you recall, RTE section 12(1)(c) refers to the reservation of 25% seats in private schools for children from economically, socially weaker backgrounds. And the Kasturi Rangan Committee observed that the scheme was not working as intended, and in fact was giving rise to a number of perverse consequences. And if the government were to consider an inclusion mechanism, perhaps direct benefits transfer was a different way of achieving the same ends. It also made a radical recommendation on revising the regulatory architecture around school and higher education. So in the case of school education, it recommends the separation of the regulation functions from the provisioning functions. So if you remember, at the state level, the State Education Department both runs government schools and is the regulator of private schools. This is a big conflict of interest. And the Kasturi Rangan Committee, I think, was the first to recognize this and to be able to recommend this based on representations from organizations like CCS, that this must change. It also recommended rethinking the role of boards. So many of you will have, sort of gone to schools that were affiliated with CBSE or with CISCE, or with other such, or the IB board, for example. One big challenge with boards is that they have sort of become more affiliation bodies rather than accreditation bodies. And in some ways, they have closed the gates to other entrants from being able to affiliate with them. They've also sort of erected barriers to non-traditional learners approaching them for taking examinations. The Kasturi Rangan Committee asked for a review of the role of boards and suggested that we move away from the current styling towards an accreditation styling. Like the Subramanian Committee, it also recommended consolidating small schools and creating what it called school complexes. And the idea of a school complex was that it would be a larger school with many shared facilities that would allow for economies of scale and could be accompanied by other kinds of transportation incentives such as busing, so that children could be able to come from a longer distance to these school complexes. It would also allow for sharing teachers. It would also allow for building subject matter expertise inside the school rather than having generalist teachers teach children, at least in advanced classes, on sort of bare tax qualifications. And the last big recommendation of the Kasturi Rangan Committee report was that, and this is a sentiment that has come through the courts in India, is that education must be not for profit, that you must not allow commercialization of education, that there is profiteering in the sector, and so on and so forth. And this is a recommendation, again, that has met with a lot of challenge from experts from outside who recognize that one part of our challenge in India is to be able to raise the level of investments in the sector, and which is why we must rethink this position. Of course, the Kasturi Rangan Committee report came out in 2019, in the middle of 2019, I think in April or May 2019. And at the time, it appeared that it would immediately be morphed into the national education policy. And therefore, it took a long time. It was quite surprising that for a long time there was no movement based on the recommendations of the committee. And just a few weeks ago, the government finally notified a pressy version of the Kasturi Rangan Committee report, largely in line with the committee's recommendations. A 60 page national education policy, both for school education as well as for higher education. And this is the sort of base intent document that we are now going to be working with, and the government is now going to be thinking about ways of implementing and executing the provisions of the recommendations of the National Education Policy 2020.